Avos series for the summer season. We're doing tonight the first parak, the 16th Mishnah. So if you have a text with you, although I'm not sure whether we'll get beyond this one Mishnah, but actually there are a couple of cross-references that we will draw upon as well. So if you have the text with you, you may want to deploy it. So Mishnah 16 says, Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer, the sage known as Rabban Gamliel, which literally means our master. Our master, Rabban Gamliel, Haya Omer, he used to say, Aseh lecha Rav, make a teacher for yourself, v'histalek min hasafek, and avoid doubt, v'al tarbe la'aser umados, and do not give excess tithes instead of measuring. Umados means by estimation. So don't give excessive tithes by just approximating your debt, your obligation, but rather calculate it accurately and give the correct amount. Don't give in excess through approximation. Now, each of these statements, we'll analyze them each in turn, and we'll also consider to what extent perhaps there is a link between each of the three of them, again, as we shall see. But the first interesting aspect I'd like to explore is the identity of this Rabban Gamliel. Now, those who have studied Talmud or Mishnah, even rabbinic teachings generally, will certainly have are we okay? Right. The identity of Rabban Gamliel, he's one of the well-known personalities, one of the early sages of the Mishnah. And his identity is worth exploring for the following reason. Rabban Gamliel, the Mishnah that we did last week was Shammai, but the Mishnayos prior to that, we had a number of teachings of Hillel. Do you remember we spoke about Hillel and Shammai, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai? So for example, in Mishnah Yud Daled, Mishnah number 14, we have Hu Haya Omer. Hu Haya Omer refers to Hillel, who was mentioned in the previous Mishnah or the Mishnah before that. So we have Hu Haya Omer, the teachings of Hillel. And now we have Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer. Now, what is the relationship between Rabban Gamliel and Hillel? So it doesn't say so here explicitly, but I wonder if anyone knows. So Hillel is known to us as Hillel Hazaken, Hillel the Elder, because there was another personality named Hillel who lived a long time after. It's called Hillel Sheni. So Hillel Hazaken is the famous Hillel, the Hillel that we were speaking about in previous weeks, Hillel and Shammai. Rabban Gamliel, according to Rashi, Rabban Gamliel was the son of Hillel, Hillel Hazaken. Actually, this is not exactly accurate. He was really the grandson. He was really the grandson of Hillel Hazaken. Hillel had a son called Shimon, and Shimon succeeded his father as the Av Beis Din, as the head of the Sanhedrin, but apparently only for a short while, only for a few years. And he died, and his son, the grandson of Hillel, succeeded him, and he became known as Rabban Gamliel. Now, the genealogy of Hillel is important because Hillel traces his origins, his genealogy to David HaMelech, King David. King David was, of course, the first king of that Davidic dynasty. He was the father of Shlomo HaMelech. He is the progenitor, ultimately, of Mashiach. He was the progenitor, that is to say, his descendants were the temporal leaders of the Jewish community, even after the Davidic kings were deposed and the Jews were thrust into exile. When they came back from exile from Babylonia, the descendants of King David remained the prominent leaders within the Jewish community. And in fact, the position of Nasi, prince, continued to attach specifically to the descendants of David HaMelech, and particularly through the line of Hillel. So Hillel Hazaken, who was so great and so humble, so learned, whose teachings are so important, so influential, also became the progenitor of the primary line of not only rabbinic leadership, but also the political leaders of the Jewish community for many, many generations and even centuries to follow. So when it says Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer, it doesn't have to tell us the famous words Kibel Mehem, because previously we had repeatedly Kibel Mehem. Like if you look back, for example, to Mishnah 12. Take a look at Mishnah 12, Yud Beis. Hillel v'Shammai kiblu mehem. Hillel and Shammai received, that is to say, they were the successors, they were the leading pair of Torah scholars in their generation, and they succeeded those who came before. Who came before? Look at the Mishnah before that. Avtalion. We have Shmaya and Avtalion. So Shmai and Avtalion in turn received from the previous generation. So our tractate begins with the famous words. I don't want to take you back needlessly, but it's helpful to remember that our tractate begins with the words Moshe Kibel Torah mi Sinai. So we start with Moshe Rabbeinu, and we say that Moshe received the Torah from Har Sinai and he transmitted it to Yoshua, etc., etc. This traces the Torah transmission through the generations. So the early generations, we have the men of the Great Assembly, and we have Shimon HaTzadik, and we go generation after generation, and each time we say, Kibel Mehem, he received from the previous generations. Here it doesn't say Kibel. So one of the commentaries explains the reason it doesn't have to say Kibel Mehem or Kibel Mimeno, that he received from the previous generation, is that we all know, as we do now in this year, because we've brought it up, Rabban Gamliel was the son, or maybe more likely the grandson of Hillel. And actually, my friends, in the subsequent Mishnayos, as we shall see, we have other teachings of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Hillel. So therefore, it doesn't have to tell us who received from whom. We're talking about the actual descendants. So naturally, they are following not only the tradition, but they are heir. These are the greatest sages of the generation. So it doesn't have to spell out the authority of this sage or that sage, is that they were the leading Talmidim, they were the successors to Shmai V'Avtalion. We don't have to say that. These are the actual descendants of Hillel Hazakim. But actually, it does pick it up. If you go forward, take a look at chapter 2, I hope you've got a text with you, take a look at Mishnah 9, chapter 2, Mishnah 9, Mishnah Tes. There we have Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Kibel Mehillel v'Shammai. After the Tana has recorded the teachings of the descendants of Hillel, and now we are going back to other great personalities, but not actual descendants of Hillel. So now when we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, if you want to know who was he, so the Mishnah tells us he was the successor, that is to say, he was the leading disciple of Hillel and Shammai as well, which when we get there, Mitzvah Hashem, we'll see the significance of telling us that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a Talmud of both Hillel and Shammai. So this is the significance of the fact that at this point we don't have Kibel Mehem, that this sage or these sages succeeded and received from the ones before them, because we know Rabban Gamliel was, of course, the son, or as I say, more likely the grandson of Hillel. But there's something else here as well, which I think is very interesting, although some have challenged the veracity of this observation, but it is quoted in the Medrash Shmuel, and he makes a very interesting observation. Hillel v'Shammai. Now, when it's translated, for example, last week's Mishnah, Shammai Omer. So he's not called Rabbi Shammai. He's not called Rabbeinu Shammai. Hillel as well. We have Shammai Hazakein, Shammai the elder. Hillel Hazakein. Hazakein doesn't refer only to longevity, his elderly status, but his the fact he's a venerated personality. But even the earlier ones, Shmai and Avtalion, what about the rabbi? Don't we give them the title rabbi? And here, this is the first time that we see Rabban Gamliel. Why is he called Rabban? Why don't we just say Gamliel? And previously we didn't have to say. The answer is, I think it's quite astute. When Hillel and Shammai were the ones who received their Torah from Shmaya and Avtalion. So Shmaya and Avtalion are very great people because they received from the generation before. And the Mishnah, that is to say, the one who has arranged these Mishnayos, that's Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, gives us the credentials and the authority of each person or pair because they were the successors to the great teachers of the previous generation. So it doesn't have to say Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi Shammai. The name alone is adequate because the Mishnah tells us they received from Shmai Vav Talgun. Here, Rabban Gamliel doesn't say that he received from Hillel, even though, as we've explained, he was a grandson of Hillel. He would have learned at the feet of his grandfather very extensively. By the way, Hillel lived a very long life. So Rabban Gamliel, very likely, he lived in the 1st century, and very likely he learned extensively from his grandfather. But since the Mishnah doesn't say explicitly he received from Hillel, therefore it has to give us his credentials, and therefore it has to say Rabban Gamliel, has to provide a title for him, someone whose renown and whose authenticity, whose wisdom and the truthfulness of his teachings is dependent on or can be attributed to the fact that he is a disciple of a great personality. So we don't have to say, by the way, he's a great rabbi in his own right, even if he were not a great rabbi in his own right, but he received wisdom and the tradition from a great teacher. Here, where the Mishnah does not tell us who he learned from and who he received from, and he's telling us what he has to say on his own authority, on his own say-so. So that's why the Mishnah says Rabban Gamliel. He was a great rabbi. Not only that, but he's the first personality in the transmission of the Torah who has a title not Rabbi and not Harav, but Rabban. What does Rabban mean? Somebody wants to take off his mute and tell us, what does Rabban actually mean? It's not translated here. It just says in the English Rabban Gamliel, and that's what he was known. It's almost became part of his name, Rabban Gamliel, and he is the first and only one of a few known by that title, Rabban. What does that actually mean, Rabban? Rabban just means our rabbi, but it is a term of reverence. It is a term that suggests he's not only the local rabbi, he's not only my rabbi, he's not only the rabbi of my community or my shul, he's Rabban, he is all of our rabbi, he's the rabbi of the generation. And so he was, as I said, as a successor, nearly successor to his grandfather Hillel HaZaken, so he was definitely the leading personality of his time. Okay, this is just by way of intro. I thought it was quite interesting when I looked into it to discover that there's much to be said even about the first few words, Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer. So now let's consider what he said. Aseh lecharav, make for yourself a rabbi or a teacher. And then he goes on to say, Histalek min hasafek. So I want to start off by saying that, of course, there has to be a relationship between these two. And I would just add a further question, which I hope is on your mind for those who have studied Pirkei Avos over the years, and especially those who were with the Kesher series when we did this last year. There's a very well-known Mishnah. Take a look at Mishnah 6. Earlier in our same chapter, Mishnah 6 is a famous Mishnah because it says, unless I got the wrong one. Wait a minute. Yeah, in Mishnah 6, Yehoshua ben Prachya v'nitai ha'arbeli, again, a pair of sages. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachya said, Aseh lecharav, k'nei lecha chaver, havedan kol adam. So we have already that same statement, make for yourself a rabbi or a teacher, k'nei lecha chaver, acquire a friend. So it's interesting that here only later on in the same chapter, one of the other sages apparently was fond of saying the same thing, Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer Aseh lecharav. But we have to wonder, even if he used to repeat that important credo, but we have to wonder, why did the compiler of the Mishnah see fit to include it a second time, as I said, within the same chapter? The answer would seem to lie in the fact that he has a different angle. His angle is Aseh lecharav v'histalek min hasafek. By designating a rabbi, you will spare yourself the suffix. Suffix is doubt. You will avoid doubt. How so? So he says that if you have a rabbi to whom you can turn, if you have a teacher, if you have an authority whose evaluation and whose ruling is acceptable and trustworthy in your eyes. So if you have a doubt, if you have a halachic question, if you're not sure the right thing to do, if you're not sure if something is tameh or tahor, kosher or not kosher, forbidden or permitted, then you have someone to turn to, and he'll resolve your uncertainty. If you have a rabbi, that's a great benefit. Many years ago, some of you may know Rabbi Joey Grunfeld. You may have come across him. Rabbi Grunfeld is the longtime director of Project Seed. He lived for many years in Gateshead. And when I first met him, he was living in Gateshead. And quite some years ago, he made a wedding, and his mechutin, I don't remember whether it was his daughter, I think it was Joey Grunfeld's daughter, was marrying the son of a certain prominent rabbi in Gateshead by the name of Rabbi Falk, Rabbi Eliyahu Falk. He actually passed away just a couple of months ago. So there was sort of the union of two distinguished rabbinic families, and Rabbi Grunfeld spoke at the wedding, and he said, in my days living in Gateshead, I had the great pleasure of living just down the road from Rabbi Falk, and I used to enjoy the convenience. Whenever I had any question, any halachic question, any uncertainty, any conundrum, I just had to walk down the road, knock on his door. I would tell him the question, and in a flash, he would give me the answer. It was a great, he said it was like instant gratification, great convenience because of his erudition. Rabbi Falk was a very distinguished posek. So he said that is the meaning of this Mishnah. You won't have the problem of doubt because he will resolve your doubts. I saw Rabbi Pinto, Rabbi David Pinto comes to Kesher pretty much every year. You may have had a chance to meet him, a friend of Miguel. So on one occasion when he was here, he gave me a sefer that he had written on Pirkei Avot. So it's one of my sources that we're drawing upon. He says something very sweet. He says, Safek. How do you spell Safek? You've got it in front of you. Samech Pei Kuf. He says, if you don't have a rabbi, then you may be left with safek. But if you have a rabbi, if you fulfill what the Mishnah says, Aseh lecha rav, so then the safek becomes pesak, pei samach kuf. Pei samach kuf is a ruling. You've got a decision. You can retire the safek and you've got the psak instead. You know what to do. So that's a great system. And he gives an example. One could choose any number of examples, but it's quite a good one because it's quite a commonplace circumstance which may arise. The Gemara in Brachos says, I'm sure all the Daf Yomi boys have certainly have learned it, and I'm sure they recall it, that the famous Gemara in the 6th parak of Brachos, Ketzam Mevachim al HaPeiros, if a person does not know what bracha to make on a food, on a fruit, on a vegetable, does it come from the ground? There can be a lot of questions that can arise. So we have a rule which is fairly well known that if a person is not certain whether he needs to make a bracha, let's say a person has cucumber, so he makes a bracha bar pri adam on a cucumber. Then he wants to eat a granola bar. So he's not sure whether granola bar is also bar pri ha'adama, in which case he doesn't need to make a bracha because he already made it. But maybe it needs a different bracha. Maybe it needs a bracha borei minei mazonos because a granola bar is made of barley and other grain products. Maybe I say borei minei mazonos. So we have a rule. When in doubt, leave it out. When it comes to a bracha, safek bracha lahakel. If a person is uncertain whether he needs to recite a bracha, so lahakel, we're lenient, don't make a bracha. The problem is that the Gemara also says clearly that someone who eats food that requires a blessing and he doesn't make a blessing on it, it's as if he has stolen the food. It's as if he's seized something that does not belong to him. The bracha is the means by which a person acquires the license to eat the food that he has. Because yes, he may have acquired that cucumber lawfully, but ultimately the whole world belongs to Hashem. It's by making the bracha, by acknowledging and thanking Hashem, that he now has the permission to eat that food. If he doesn't make a bracha, then it's ke'ilu ma'al. It's as if he has seized something to which he has no right. So this formula, safek brachos lahakel, it's actually not so safe to rely upon, because a person might have avoided possibly making a blessing that he should not be reciting that's unnecessary, but on the other hand, he may be eating something that is tantamount in a certain sense to theft, because he has to make a bracha before he really has the right to eat it. So the Gemara says, well, the answer, of course, is he has to learn what the halacha is. He's got to go to a rabbi and gain an education in the matter of brachos. So this is just, again, a simple example. If a person knows the halacha, or if he has a rabbi to guide him or to teach him, if he becomes knowledgeable and learned in his own right, then he won't be faced with a suffix what bracha to make. I'll just mention, by the way, it happens to be a machlokas about the granola bar. There are different opinions as to whether a person should say mazonos. I always used to say bori mini mazonos, but I looked into it more closely, and now I say bori priya adama. So in some cases, especially with modern food technology, in Talmudic times, I'm not sure they had granola bars, you see. So there are certain things which, have developed, which actually do give rise to legitimate question. But in any case, just an illustration of the point that if a person has a Rav, then he can, by that means, he can avoid and sort of escape from the clutches of a suffix of uncertainty. But I saw Medrash Shmuel, who is, I mentioned him a few times. This is Medrash Shmuel. It's an anthology, a very classic anthology. It's been reprinted many times. In fact, I don't know if I mentioned, I found that I've actually bought this sefer 3 different times. On my shelf, I got 3 different versions of it. I bought one like 10 years ago, one 20 years, one 30 years ago. Anyway, so if anyone wants an extra copy of Medrash Shmuel, I'm happy to make it available at a discount price. So Medrash Shmuel, he says something a bit more sophisticated. He says like this, Aseh lecha rav yistalek min hasafek. He says, if you have a rabbi who is your Rebbe Muvhak, he is your primary teacher, and you have learned your approach to life from him, and he has guided you in the study of Torah in a halachic tradition, then in this way, you will have a clear path, a path of avodas Hashem, a path in life itself, a path in halachic adjudication, a path in Torah study. If you learn from a rabbi who is, worthy of the designation, and you have accepted from him your derech, you won't have a suffix because you'll have clear guidance. But if you have multiple rabbis and you learn different things from different rabbis, now, in many respects, no doubt that can be a good thing. But there's a pitfall to it, because if you have one rabbi, you will avoid the confusion. But if you have one well-defined path, and in that way, you'll have clarity. But if you have multiple rabbis, so then you'll sometimes be besafek. You yourself will be in doubt because you've got so many different approaches in your mind. Okay, it may not apply necessarily to what bracha on a granola bar, but maybe there are larger issues that you want to consider. In terms of a job to pursue, where to live, what school to send your children to, many other questions that a person may encounter, and he may seek the advice of a certain rabbi, or he may decide on his own, based on his own wisdom and understanding, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But if he has kind of reverberating in his mind or in the recesses of his memory all different approaches, which may be in some respects in conflict with one another, then he will be confused and he'll be besafek. Whereas if he was following a well-defined path of one rabbi, then he wouldn't have that problem. And he explains this as well with the last part of the Mishnah. Take a look, the last words, Al tarbe la'aser umados. Do not increase, do not give an excessive ma'aser because you're approximating it. Now, we'll go back to this again shortly, but I would just like to clarify this maaser. It doesn't refer to the maaser that we have nowadays of giving 1/10 of one's earnings to tzedakah. There, if a person estimates and gives generously, so I don't think that's a bad thing. But in the use of the Mishnah, we're talking about a farmer who has X number of barrels or bushels of apples or wheat, and he needs to give maaser to the Levi or to the poor, depending on the year, and he's supposed to give 10%. That's the simple, meaning from the context, which we'll explore further in a short while. But I want to just explain how the Medrash Shmuel interprets this in terms of the first two sayings. The first saying is, establish for yourself a clear path in Torah, and by so doing, you will avoid histalek min hasafek. But then he explains the last phrase as well, va'al tabel umados, because he says umados means to approximate, to guess. It doesn't necessarily mean like a wild guess. It could be an educated guess, but it still is a guess rather than clarity and precision based on measurement. So if a person, let's say a rabbi, is confronted with a halachic question, and he needs to evaluate it on his own as best he can, but he's seeking to apply conflicting halachic traditions in his own mind. So he is faced with a safek because he's needs to choose among different traditions, and he is also evaluating it according to one approach or a different approach or a third approach. That's umados, where it doesn't have absolute clarity. It hasn't been measured precisely. He's just kind of trying to assess it the best he can. So again, I'm sure there's benefit to learning from more than one teacher, but it can come with a cost as well. And Rabban Gamliel is teaching that by having a Rebbe Mufhak, a person can avoid these problems. From here, I want to go to my friend Irving Bunim, and I quote him almost every week because he's always reliable to tell us something which is insightful and also contemporary. So Irving Bunim, just a biographical comment, he was a businessman, he was a great activist, he was a raconteur, he was a philanthropist, he was an advocate for Jewish causes in government and within the Jewish world as well, for Orthodox causes, Jewish education, and that sort of thing. And he had opportunity to speak to a lot of balabatim because he was, as I say, an activist, he was a fundraiser, he was a raconteur, so he got around a lot. He lived in New York and he had a lot of exposure. And he frequently finds, and I'm laughing a little bit, he finds opportunities to advise the search committee of what kind of rabbi they should choose. And frequently, and this Mishnah is another such opportunity that he seizes upon. So he says, Aseh lecha Rav, you're head of a search committee for a rabbi for your shul. So what qualities are you looking for? So he says, the Mishnah tells us, choose a rabbi who is competent to give definitive halachic guidance. You choose a rabbi who has the clarity and the authority and the erudition to provide a clear, definitive, reliable halachic guidance, not the ignorant leading the clueless. Choose a rabbi of stature. He even says that, shuls, they want a rabbi who can speak well, who can socialize with people, and who can raise money. Those are usually the qualities that they're searching for. But do they take into account his Torah knowledge, his Yiras Shamayim, and other qualities? Basically, he's saying that don't choose a rabbi for the wrong reason. He gives an example. He says, like, someone's looking for a wife, so maybe he loves her because she's great on the dance floor, or because she's a marvelous cook, or because he mentions another quality. I can't remember which one, but you can fill in the blank for yourself. He says, okay, these may be qualities which are appealing, but do they represent the essential, most important features that someone is looking for in a marriage partner? So he says, by way of analogy, Aseh lecha Rav, who has the authority, histalek min hasafek, to provide clear guidance and clear leadership. And then he explains as well, which many of the other mafarshim mention also, why does it say al tabel aser umados? What's wrong if you give a bit more? So the word ma'aser, of course, means a tenth. The word tithe, the English word tithe, comes from the word tenth, which in turn comes from the word maaser. So don't give more than a tenth. Don't just estimate and give more. Why not? So as I said, in terms of tzedakah that we give nowadays, the more the better. But in the case of the farmer who's supposed to give, let's say he has 100 bushels, he's supposed to give 10 bushels of wheat. If he gives 11 bushels of wheat, so the 11th bushel of wheat, actually, because it isn't maaser, it's just an extra bushel of wheat that he's giving to the Levi. The Levi is not really entitled to it. It means that that bushel has to, the maaser, or rather the truma, has to be taken still from that bushel. I don't want to get needlessly complicated, but the point is that there is a downside to giving too much as well. Obviously, we're not talking about down to the last kernel of grain, but to the extent that it's reasonable to make a measurement, whether by weight, by volume, or whatever method, a person is required to do so. He shouldn't just, approximate. He shouldn't just get by with a guesstimate in that way, because by so doing, one can actually undermine the authenticity and the accuracy of the mitzvah itself. From here, I want to take us further back in history, chronologically, to Rabbeinu Yonah. We've quoted Rabbeinu Yonah a few times. This is the famous Rabbeinu Yonah of Girona. It even rhymes. Girona is a town which you can find not too far from Barcelona, and it was like the gateshead of Catalonia in medieval times, and Ramban lived there, and many other sages also. And Rabbeinu Yonah lived at the same time as Ramban. Actually, he was an elder contemporary and a relative of Ramban. So he says like this: Aseh lecha rav, a novelty. Aseh lecha rav, obviously every person needs a teacher. How is he going to learn, and how is he going to achieve any Torah greatness if he doesn't have a teacher? You can't be self-taught. You can't learn everything from YouTube. So of course, Aseh lecha rav. The chidush he says here is that even if you have a safek, you have a doubt, and you don't have access to your own rabbi, your own teacher, you may not even have access to anyone who's greater than you. Maybe you only have a colleague who's not necessarily more learned than you are. He says, make that colleague your teacher. If you are in doubt, speak to him about it, whoever that person may be. Maybe he'll help you to clarify it. Histalek min hasafek. By humbling yourself and by approaching someone, it's not like humiliation. You're just saying, look, I don't know the answer. Let's discuss it. I'm thinking about this, or is it this way? I'm not certain. So discuss it. Seek to clarify it. His input, his contribution, his perspective may have the effect of enabling you to gain clarity in it. And I think that's so true. It's not maybe such a great novelty, but perhaps, as I said a moment ago, there may be a measure of humility that a person has to be prepared to swallow his pride and to speak to a friend or a colleague to say, I'm not sure what the halacha is in this case. What do you say? I don't in any way want to suggest that I exemplify the teachings of Pirkei Avos, but I can tell you that on many occasions, if I have a question, whether it's a practical halachic matter or just something I've come across in my studies, maybe sometimes people have asked me a question and I'm not quite sure of the answer, or I'm anticipating a certain situation and I'm not quite sure what to do. I ask my chavrusa, and we've been learning together for many years. I think he would probably agree that we're broadly compatible in terms of our learning, and yet it's not uncommon that I'll ask him. Sometimes he'll say, I really don't know, or sometimes he'll say, I definitely don't know, but I think maybe this is correct or that is correct. And very often, just by discussing it, at least in my own mind, I have reached a conclusion which I consider to be reliable. So that's how he explains Aseh lecha rav, even if he's not really worthy of being your teacher because you're more learned than he is. But nevertheless, by turning to him, to that person, histalek min hasafek, he may resolve a suffix. And he actually quotes a little formula from the Gaonim, which again, it's maybe intuitively sensible, but it's nice to see a clear formulation in the writings of the Gaonim. He says, if one authority is uncertain about a halacha, and another authority has clarity in the halacha, meaning he in his own mind feels that the halacha is definitely like this, then the halacha follows the one who is certain, even if the one who is certain is the Talmud and the one who is uncertain is the Rebbe. In other words, the Rebbe whose learning is probably much greater than the Talmud, one would have thought, he's uncertain, but the Talmud is confident in the halacha, so we follow the one who is certain if the only other opinion that is under consideration is uncertain. Okay, so that's what he says about Istalik Manasafet. But I have to tell you that to my mind, the most compelling interpretation, which doesn't in any way refute or detract from what we've said so far tonight, but I find a very compelling interpretation, is that of Dr. Twersky. Dr. Twersky says, he asks the question that we mentioned along the way, why does the Mishnah repeat Aseh lecha rav? It's very pithy and it's very punchy and it's very important, it's very true, but it's already mentioned earlier in the same chapter. Why repeat it here? Okay, if maybe Rabban Gamliel used to say it, but why repeat it? Why does it's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi who arranged the Mishnayos? He says the answer is that he is talking here about a person who is prone to what we call today, I don't know what they called it in the first century, but we call it today obsessive compulsive disorder. A person who is, like we say today, OCD. So he is someone who has what's known as the doubting disease, sometimes called the doubting disease, an inability to accept anything with certainty. And without suggesting that religious Jews are more prone to having OCD, but one could make an argument along those lines that the halachic system, which does contain a lot of detail, a lot of, I don't want to use the word minutiae because I think it has a pejorative connotation, but a lot of detail, it informs and ennobles so much of life, and it provides guidance in so much of what we do, that a person who is prone to OCD and he is raised within, or he embraces the halachic system, it could, push him further along that path. And I'm certain, again, he doesn't say so explicitly here, but no doubt in Dr. Twersky's career, he came across many people like that, including, I'm sure, more than a few religious Jews. He mentions, for example, a woman who suffered from OCD, and she washed her hands repeatedly until they were raw, because she was concerned of contaminating the dairy with the meat, or the meat with the dairy. If she served, I don't know, pizza for lunch, and now she's serving steak for dinner, and she would wash her hands so often that they became raw from all the washing. I mean, nowadays with this coronavirus, when that is actually not only advisable, but it may be compulsory in many circumstances. Again, I'm not being flippant. Someone who has that tendency for hand washing excessively, it could push such a person to an unhealthy extreme. But okay, that's the circumstance. So Dr. Twersky says it. She just couldn't accept that there's no need to do that the halacha separating meat and milk doesn't compel her to wash her hands, repeatedly. I saw elsewhere, Dr. Twersky writes that another woman threw out 3 sets of dishes because she was convinced they weren't kosher. And even though the rabbi assured her it wasn't necessary, she was certain the rabbi didn't understand her question, didn't understand the severity of the circumstance. It's that inability to gain or to accept the clarity and the certainty. So that's what Rabban Gamliel may be telling us. Aseh lecha rav, a person who has the confidence in rabbinic guidance, who has a rabbi who instills confidence within him or her, he's talek min hasafek. In so doing, a person can avoid that uncertainty, that doubt, and that nagging sense of insecurity about, have I done the right thing? I learned it from Ruthie, actually, because she's been been doing some work in this area in her counseling part of her life. Scrupulosity. It's a neologism, scrupulosity, and its meaning is apparent from what it says. Someone who is excessively scrupulous. And again, I think that someone who seeks to live within the halachic system can, in theory, become prone to that habit, to that problem. So, according to this, he says, "Asel charav," and then histalik min hasavek ve'al tarbe la'ase umados, and don't rely on your estimation, don't rely on your guesswork, because that sows the seeds of doubt, the seeds of anxiety, uncertainty, insecurity. Did I do it right? Did I take enough? Did I give enough maser, as the case may be? So, if a person has a trustworthy authority, he is spared the torment of doubt. That's what Rabbi Tursky says about this Mishnah. He doesn't need my imprimatur, but I think it could well explain why the Mishnah repeats it. Repeats Aseh L'Chara because it's in a particular context in this case. We just have a few minutes left, and I'd like to share a closing story. This tradition, this message of Aseh L'Chara, we mentioned one of the commentaries said that it says that it refers to a person regarding his own Torah growth, regarding his own path in Torah, and his own confidence that he's following a path which is the right path for him. If he has a rabbi who is reliable, who has himself a valid Masorah, a tradition, he has the confidence that he's on the right path. And if he has multiple rabbis, then again there may be some benefits to that. I'm sure there are, but there can be a downside as well. I learned in yeshiva called Chavetz Chaim in Israel initially, then in Milwaukee, where they had a new branch at that time. It's not new anymore. That was about 35 years ago, close to 40 years ago, and then in the main branch of the yeshiva, which is in Queens, in New York City. And I learned there for many years. And although I learned elsewhere after that, but my primary path in Torah, I would attribute to my time in Chavetz Chaim Yeshiva. And they were very much devoted to the idea of Masorah, to the tradition that they would see, they meaning the yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva, would seek to transmit to the Bachrim, to the younger light. And he in turn was a Talmud of his father, who was a Talmud of the Alter of Slobodka, the great yeshiva in Slobodka in Kovna. And we in the yeshiva saw ourselves as seeking at least to continue the values and the traditions and the teachings and the Musar emphasis that originated in Slobodka or reached a lofty expression in Slobodka yeshiva. In fact, a few years before I came to the yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva who left Slobodka when he was a boy, he was born in 1918, his father moved to New York in 1928. So he was about 10 years old when he moved to New York City. And I guess he hadn't remembered, but he learned many, many years later that in Slobodka, they used to sing Adon Olam after davening on Shabbos morning. Now, a lot of yeshivas don't. Anyone who's been to yeshivas, most yeshivas, certainly the more classic yeshivas, they don't sing Adon Olam after davening. They don't do it. They don't do that much singing. But when he was reminded or advised by someone who learned in Slobodka, at the time itself. Anyway, so we started to sing Adon Olam after davening. I'm not saying that's the only reason we do Adon Olam at Kesher, but it's part of the reason we sing Adon Olam at Kesher. So Chavetz Chaim Yeshiva placed a great deal of emphasis on the idea of Masorah, Aseh L'Charav, and following a well-defined path. It doesn't mean it's a narrow path, but it's a reliable path. And a person who seeks guidance or seeks the right path for him, then he can refer to those teachings or confer with colleagues or Rabbanim from the yeshiva. The Rosh Yeshiva himself, I heard this story from him some years ago. He since passed away. I said he was born in 1918, so he doesn't live forever. He lived to 90. He died in 2008. Anyway, he took over the yeshiva when he was 23 years old. His father died in 1941, and he inherited the yeshiva at the tender age of 23. He was an only child as well. to run a yeshiva in New York in 1941, it was a fledgling yeshiva, was very difficult. And during the war years, you can imagine how difficult it was. And in the 1950s and even into the 60s, Torah study was not the flavor of the week in the United States or probably anywhere else in the world. And to raise money for such a project and to attract students to come to learn for years at a time, it really wasn't in step with the aspirations of most American Jews who were rushing headlong to assimilation, and this sort of thing was not their bag. And he was getting quite disheartened. He was in his 40s, and in the 1960s, he felt he's going to give it up. He just can't take the pressure of the fundraising, going door to door, trying to keep the doors of the yeshiva open, trying to attract boys to come and learn, which there was very little interest in that sort of thing. And he had an opportunity to pick up sticks and to move to Israel and to become a posek. As I said, he, well, I didn't say, but he was a great Talmid Chacham, great intellectual ability. His father was a great nephew of the Chavetz Chaim, so he had enough yichus to burn as well. And he could become a posek and sit in a religious neighborhood in Jerusalem, and that will be his contribution to the Jewish world. He said he was sorely tempted to do it. But he heard again and again in his mind, in his ringing in his ears with the teaching of his father. His father said that your task is to be a teacher, to be a melamed. The Jewish people in this generation, more than anything else, they need someone to teach Torah, to teach others to teach Torah, to inspire people to teach Torah, to draw people near to Torah. Becoming a posek in Yerushalayim is a very wonderful thing, but that's not your calling. That's not the charge of the generation. That's not what Slobodka tradition has imbued you with. And for that reason, he said he decided to stick it out. And that was his suffix, and that was the resolution of his suffix, difficult though it was. And actually, it was shortly after that that he began to see more and more success. By the time I was in the yeshiva, it was already flourishing. Now it's about 3 times the size that it was then. It has made a major impact on the Jewish world. So this is Aseh lecha rav yistalek min hasafek. Everyone has questions, doubts. What shall he do? Decision making. But if a person has the benefit of a Rav, not that the rabbi always will give the right answer, but the advantage of having that clarity, the rabbi himself may say, I don't know, you've got to decide on your own, but at least you've got someone to refer to, a source of guidance, and this is Histalek min hasafek through Aseh lecha rav. Thank you very much, and next week we do another fascinating Mishnah. Every week you do a fascinating one. The son of Rabban Gamliel, he says, all my life I grew up among the wise and I found nothing better for life than silence. So on that note, we'll end for tonight and we'll daven Maariv until next Sunday. We'll take it up again. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.